Good to see you, Robert.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, good to see both of you. Welcome back, Robert. You're our most frequent guest, but there are always so many different topics to talk about with you.
Yeah, I'm happy.
So now today, we're going to talk about some of the latest thinking you've been doing on net zero targets, corporate net zero targets. Should we start by just what prompted this? Like, why did you even sit down and think, okay, we need potentially a different way to go about this?
Yeah, I think I can't recall exactly why, but like 6 months ago, I wrote this LinkedIn post saying net zero is not for hard-to-abate companies. And then I threw in that, but maybe they can set conditional net zero targets for even if they're hard-to-abate. And then that stuck with me, thinking about, if that concept could be developed more. And then for our Milkywire Climate Transformation Fund, we did kind of a more 5-year retrospect, really going back to what did we do right, what were the questions we tried to answer, what are the remaining questions. And one of the learnings from that was really that there's a need for a new narrative where basically the net zero decade is over, maybe starting after Paris and then ending with the election of Donald Trump again. And the kind of narrative that was prevalent that companies just set these targets and they work together to reach them is in a need of an update. And we need a bit different narrative of what we actually can expect from companies and sort of what is good and how does all of this fit together. And I think it's about high time for that. And I see other voices also kind of starting to grapple at this and figuring out how to present it. So that's why I wrote this first article, A New Lens on Net Zero, introducing conditional targets, and more articles are going to follow, kind of more operationalizing this. But importantly, this is kind of an overlay on existing standards. It's not proposing like a whole new standard or challenging SBTi or anything. It's more that companies have their targets, but how should we actually view them? And what are the most important things that companies should be doing? And how does that differ between different types of sectors and business models?
What I hear, and it came up recently at our scope with Alexia, is that the current landscape is already so incredibly complex. So adding another layer on top of it looks to be increasing that complexity. So what's the plan? Like how will this help?
Well, the purpose is to simplify the complexity, really, like not to add more complexity. By explaining what is actually going on here and being concretely, what we're talking about is that some emissions are within corporate control pretty clearly, whereas others are outside of their direct control. If it's like their ability to control it, or if there is their financial ability to do something about it. And we should treat these two different parts of companies' inventories differently, and have different expectations. So I think by putting this kind of layer on top of what we have with corporate targets, it can be clearer what companies are actually going to do, and there can be I think clearer expectations also, and not have the kind of false sense of it is being under control because we have 10,000 companies with targets and thousands of companies with net zero targets, and also push more for the type of systemic change that is actually needed, that is not directly within corporate control.
One thing that stood out to me when you talk about operational net zero is, and you actually posted about this today as well, about the financial ability of a company to actually decarbonize its scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? And today you posted how the green premium varies just massively depending on the industry. And some of those numbers were really high, like north of $1,000, right? And so to me, what I struggle with a little bit with your concept is it doesn't seem black or white, right? Like there seems to be such a spectrum, both on the operational net zero, but also the conditional net zero. And that's where the complexity I fear comes in, because we can't define exactly where to draw the line, right? What should companies do versus what is not reasonable? So how do you approach, especially thinking maybe about the financial ability? Where are we drawing the line on that?
Yeah, no, it's grayscale all the way down. Like there's no clear cut, but I think it's better to be honest about that than to pretend that kind of clear cut exists. Like describing it doesn't change reality. The reality is there anyway. Like you can have a net zero target and not talk about part of it being conditional, but then you just pretending it's not there. I think by kind of shining a light on it, it makes it clear to everyone what we can expect. So just to take some examples, like for some companies, they have relative big control of their supply chain and they have financial muscles. Like IKEA is a good example. They are vertically integrated. They design and manufacture their own products, and they can choose to switch materials to quite a large degree. They can mandate what their suppliers do, and they can probably reach quite a large share of their emission reductions with actions that they take. And the cost of doing so may not be like huge compared to their profits. I don't have like exact numbers for them, but I think it's a good example. Whereas if you talk about, let's say, a cement company like that has multiple cement facilities producing it, they have the agency that they could install CCS. No one is stopping them. They could capture the CO2. They own the facility, but the financial ability is not there if we don't have policy that sort of sets a level playing field. The cost of installation would raise their prices quite a lot, and there's maybe some demand for green cement, so they could do it on maybe one facility or so. But reaching net zero across all other facilities across the world would really require that you have policies in place in all those different jurisdictions that basically force at least a majority of their competitors to do the same. So even if you sort of have control, it may still be financially unavailable. And exactly what is like financially unavailable, that is going to be like a subjective thing. Like on the one end, you could say that, well, if it takes more than a company's entire profits across like average over a number of years, then it's probably pretty clearly not viable. But should it take 10% of profits, 1% of profits? That's subjective. And that's not something that we can hide from anyway.
So you've been writing about it now twice. You mentioned that there's more in the pipeline. So it sounds like you're not going about it as if it was another theoretical exercise. You actually want to build it into something that could be used in practice. What has the first feedback been from different corporates? Do they feel like this is an answer to some of the questions they have? Or what are their key concerns when it comes to implementing something like this?
No, that's a great question. I had a lot of high quality feedback. I would say that it's overwhelmingly positive, where people agree, especially with the diagnosis. I mean, people point out what Sebastian just said, like how do we know? How can we make that kind of distinction? Is that not going to be very difficult? And that's also what the next paper will be about, like operationalizing conditional targets. Like how could you actually look at it? What are the things that go into it? And as I just described, kind of agency, if you control emissions, is one axis, and another axis is economic feasibility, and you're going to be kind of on that pathway. Another concern that some have is that it can be used as a smokescreen. Like companies can just say that, well, most of our emissions are conditional, so we don't really need to care about it. But I think a really important answer to that is that if you declare emissions conditional, your responsibility to try to enact those large-scale systemic changes that are needed for your targets to be able to be fulfilled actually increases. And that means lobbying for the type of change that your target needs, funding that type of organizations that are working towards it, like NGOs and so on, funding R&D efforts, funding the type of climate interventions that are needed for your target ultimately to be fulfilled, even if you can't account for it. So I think a big problem with today's net zero paradigm is that it maybe inadvertently pushes companies to only do things they can account for, but those are not necessarily the most important things that should be done. So that's really a key thing that I want to push for. But yeah, so these types of things are what comes up in the discussions around the concept.
On that conditional net zero, though, and on this kind of idea of advocating for specific policy changes, for example, and funding them, it just sounds very fuzzy, right? It sounds like something that companies could easily do very, very little and still get away with it. And historically, that doesn't sound like something that could easily be made. You could make a case to your CFO, right? Like, whereas with net zero, it's like, okay, here's an equation. This is what we need. This is how much budget I need. So how do you see that working out for this conditional net zero for companies to actually put skin in the game on it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not proposing an oversight committee that's going to say which companies are doing what. It's more a way for companies, and it could be built into standards. So the SBTi could have something like that. ISO, I think, will have probably more of those kind of things when that comes out. But I think the alternative, just to pretend that it's not there and just wait for companies to fail their net zero targets, which most of them will because it's not within their control, it's not better. So what I'm proposing is not perfect, but I think it's better than the alternative.
And I mean, we're coming back to this. Like one thing is the conditionality of this whole, but then the control, right? Where the companies have control and where they don't, which basically defines that, what should be conditional and what shouldn't. So you've been doing plenty of thinking around this, and I'm just wondering if you already have some examples. Like as you mentioned, it's a grayscale when it comes to control, all the way from one end to the other. Have you seen that there are areas where companies think that they have more control than they actually have? And are there areas where they are underestimating how much control they actually have in practice?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of thoughts that would pop up into your head when you think about this is that, well, it's matching to scopes. So, well, scope 1 and 2, especially scope 1 is in your control, and then scope 3 is outside your control. But I don't think this neatly matches onto greenhouse gas accounting scopes, where for some companies, scope 1 is definitely something that they can do, get all the way down to zero. But as in the example with the cement company, it may not be economically feasible, even though it's in their scope 1. And in scope 3, a lot of the things are outside of the agency of companies because they're so far down the line. Like if you're talking the 3rd order, 4th order, 10th order supplier, like your supplier, then you don't know who that is, and there's no way for you directly to control it. So in some examples, it's relatively easy. In others, I think it's pretty clear that you don't have control, especially if you're using spend-based accounting and you don't really know what emissions are, you probably don't have that much control over it as a kind of rule of thumb.
And on this vertical, you mentioned IKEA as an example earlier, right? I'm just wondering, is there a case to be made that the companies that have done a better job at integrating vertically and understanding also their emissions more are almost going to be punished in this framework, whereas the ones that have kept at arm's length their suppliers are going to get away with it?
I would say that if your business model is to be more vertically integrated, like designing your own products, then you do have more control. And yeah, you have then, you could say, a great responsibility to do something about it. If you are a company that outsources everything, let's say a food store, for example, like they have almost zero control of their scope 3 emissions because it's like thousands of different products from thousands of brands across the world that sell to a lot of different food stores. So of course they can do some things on scope 3. They can change what people buy a little bit with how they front products and so on. So it's not like entirely outside of their control. But yeah, for them it is much harder. So I mean, you could frame it. It's an interesting framing that you phrase here, that certain business, because of how they're organized, would be punished in the way that they have more responsibility to do things. But I would have to think more about it. But it may just be inherent to reality, basically.
And I'm thinking thinking ahead, like if I'm a business and I still have a choice of which direction to go, And let's say the easier choice that costs me less and I can still do net zero is one where I keep suppliers at arm's length, then it might create kind of perverse incentives in a certain way. That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, sure. Like a net zero target is not a net zero target. For some companies their net zero targets are much more believable and achievable as well. And I think now it's completely hidden because like my local food store has a net zero target and IKEA. And for consumers, it looks like, well, they're both net zero targets. Whereas one of them are absolutely not going to reach it. And the other one is doing a lot. So I don't think that this framework actually makes this worse.
It doesn't make it worse. So hopefully the idea is that it makes it better, right?
Yeah. No, the clarity increases. I think the sort of unfairness may remain to some extent, but it forces companies to at least spell out what are the things that would need to happen for my net zero target to be achievable, and then also to say, what am I doing then to help achieve this?
I'm wondering, as you're working a lot on removals and you're working a lot on this on different corporate net zero approaches, is there a peculiar impact this approach would have on helping to scale removals, or you don't really see that big a difference?
It affects removals for sure, but in two different ways, I would say, that maybe contradict each other a little bit. Because on the one hand, it points out that for most companies, if they actually want to reach net zero, not just say that a lot of it is conditional and it's outside of our, if they want to make the target actually happen, they're probably going to have to use a lot more removals than 10%. It's relatively few companies that I think removals that would only be 10%, because it shows how large share of your emissions are outside of your direct control. And for those that don't have financial ability, they probably won't have financial ability to buy loads of removals either. But for the companies that do have like the financial muscles, they would see that, well, it's a pretty big chunk that we really can't control. So why don't we just buy carbon removal and make a net zero claim? And here operational net zero comes in, which is a practice that we see companies like Schneider Electric, Siemens, Zurich Insurance, and so on, that buy carbon removal to meet the 2030 target for their scope 1 and 2, and often business travel as well, which is kind of a micro net zero, so to say. So this is included in this lens on net zero, that for the emissions that you do control, you could have operational net zero for part of them, and I think that's where most near-term demand from CDR actually is coming right now, and will continue to come. But it needs a bit more validation for like SBTi and ISO to really mainstream it, I think. But then the thing that would be maybe negative for CDR is if people start viewing their net zero targets as something they don't need to achieve anyway, because it's conditional, and then they may not feel the urge to buy CDR either. But my answer to that is that those companies probably wouldn't have bought CDR in any case. But that is a risk, at least, for CDR.
But it does sound that I still get stuck on that financial ability point, because it does. I know you said earlier we can't really put a number on it, but it feels like there needs to be some sort of guidance on what that financial ability means, because otherwise companies will always be able to hide behind it, right? So I don't know if it's a percentage of profit, whatever it is, right?
Yeah, we can set a number. We can set a number, but it will be arbitrary. Like there's no way around it. Like we can agree on a reasonable number, but there's no physical reality behind what is. It's too much to spend all of your profits and go bankrupt. That's like the stop, right? But then it's just downwards from there, basically.
What do you think is reasonable? Yeah, what do you think? You've done a lot of work on kind of profitability of companies and carbon removals. Like, what is reasonable and feasible?
I think for public companies, it's harder, because then they have the shareholders and it's the fiduciary duties and so on. It may be hard for them to spend 20-30% of their profits on CDR. I think as things are organized now, the CEO that proposes that would not be the shareholders will remove them. Whereas for family-owned companies or private companies, they could do a lot more. Should we then expect a private company just because they can to do more than the public company? It's one benchmark, of course, is like how much does companies spend on philanthropy right now? And it's hard to get a great number, but there's estimates of like 1% of profits across at least US companies going to philanthropy. 1% seems very reasonable, but again, it's going to be arbitrary. And some companies are just going to they're just going to try to do the right thing and actually make sure they don't have an impact on the warming of the world, like Microsoft is actually doing. And some companies are just going to do what they're forced to, either by a voluntary standard saying that it's minimum 1%, or by compliance and laws and rules.
So now that we have read some of your thinking and we're hearing here as well, and we know that there's more coming, can you give a bit of a teaser? And I assume that you don't only look at how to, like what kind of guidance to put forward, but also what kind of governance there should be around it. I'm really curious to understand what you have in mind here.
Yeah. Well, the governance, I think, is one thing of describing the problem and giving tools for companies and others to make their own efforts clearer. It's more having a narrative where things make sense, and also like a logical reason to explain, like, why are we doing this? Why are we funding these things that we can't account for in our own accounting? So that's like a tool that there's no need for governance for that to happen. I think governance would happen probably on a standard level, where like the SBTi and ISO. I'm not suggesting like a new governance institution, or that Milkywire should sit and kind of say what like you as a company are clearly doing the wrong thing or something like that. I think it would live in those existing institutions, and they don't need to change the whole thing. It's more like things that could be clarified and tweaked where these type of things exist. Like SBTi already actually asks companies to list dependencies, but they don't go the whole way, let's say, to do this.
Maybe one level up. You said also in your piece that 29% of companies have a net zero target today, and that's a good thing, right? And I guess glass half full or half empty, but obviously it's an incredibly small number if we think about the overall job that needs to get done. So I was just wondering, maybe tied into the concept that you're proposing here, but do you think this will help drive more companies to sign up to this, or do you actually think it could do the opposite?
I think it can drive more companies, because you can actually, like, if I had a hard-to-abate company with today's rules, I would never set the net zero target, because like there's no way I can reach it, right? Why would I promise something I have no control over? This at least gives you a way of saying, like, well, we want to reach net zero, and this is what we can do. These are the things that needs to change outside of our company for this target to be achievable, but phrase it in a way that's clear that you can't sue me because I don't reach it, right? This was clear from the beginning. I didn't promise myself to do all of this. So I would expect more companies, especially hard-to-abate companies, to dare to set net zero if this was clearer.
But I mean, you're selling this concept as something like that would be another layer on something that already exists, right? Like the SBTi targets. But what about companies who are looking at, well, the SBTi approach looks very cumbersome. Why don't they just go for this? Just conditional targets where applicable, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, they can. No one is forcing companies to be part of standards. Like, the reason they do is because they want extra credibility behind their targets and their claims, to show stakeholders, often their suppliers or investors or so on, are urging them to set SBTi targets. So I think if they want that extra validity from someone else, the need to have a standard, but it could be ISO as well. I'm really looking forward to the new ISO standard. I think much looks like it's going to be even more feasible, I should say. So if you like that, you need a standard. If you want to set your own target, the company's already doing it. Microsoft don't have a validation. They're not part of their net zero target is not SBTi validated, for example. They're just doing what they want. I think the thing to watch out for is claims then. If a company claims that we're already at net zero and we have carbon neutral products or so on, that's where there's a need to be for more scrutiny.
Because for me, at the end of the day, obviously we've got the buyers that already exist and they're doing it for the reasons that are well known. But when I talk about kind of the next wave of buyers or the ones on the fringes, it's net zero is not really why they're considering it, right? They're considering buying because it helps them with something that has nothing to do with carbon removal, with net zero. It's because it helps them ensure that they keep getting cocoa from West Africa. It helps ensure that they don't have to pay absurd insurance premiums in the future. They can continue as a business, right? It's other things. And so what do you think can actually make a dent in the next 5 years in particular? Do you think that a renewed net zero framing will drive the next wave of buyers, or should we actually focus our efforts on other things that might have nothing to do with net zero?
Right. So like this is the whole idea, but this is not it's not for CDR in particular, but CDR is a part of it. So I think what will drive most buyers right now is near-term targets. And even though like I really tried for the last 5 years to convince companies to, well, you should fund things you don't have to account for and so on. Like the biggest appetite is when there's a use case. I talked to a really big company yesterday and I said, well, like, have you changed your mind on CDR? And they said, no, because there's no use case. And they had an SBTi target. But we do see plenty of companies that are using them anyway, even no one is validating them, and they're using them to reach 2030 targets, or they're planning to use them to reach these 2030 targets. So I think that's where most near-term demand will come from. And I do think we have a good chance of getting more official validation for something like that. Scope 1 and 2 in business travel is small. Like it's not a huge, like we're not talking about hundreds of millions of tons, but we're talking about millions of tons, maybe tens of millions of tons. So it is a huge demand signal. So that's where I put most of my hope, like the vast majority of my hope for growth in durable CDR in the next 5 years. It is near-term targets.
So short-term operational net zero, kind of
basically,
scope 1 and 2,
whatever you call it.
Travel.
Whatever you call it, but those kind of things, yes.
So what's next now immediately? What's in the plans? Are you going to continue developing this approach yourself with Milkywire? Is there going to be some kind of process where other people feed into it? Like, where would you like it to grow?
Yes. So I have discussions with some possible co-authors of the next paper who are kind of institutions and academics and so on that are writing about the space already, that are interested. So it's on me to send them kind of a first draft of what I'm thinking. And then we'll see if it's like, it's going to be a co-publication across several institutions. My working name is more like conditional targets in practice, describing this agency versus economic feasibility. And then hopefully actually trying to put some numbers on different sectors. What could it look like? Like with wide brackets, but like, what are we talking about here? Who could this apply to, and what are the big changes? And basically then take it from there with giving more details. I wanted to put out the broader lens first, and then go into the more kind of nitty-gritty details, like, if we really did this, what would it look like? What are the things that companies would need to do, and how would their reporting change, and so on. So that's what I'm exploring. Now.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, keep us posted. I'm sure we're going to have you back on. And thank you very much for joining us today, Robert.
Well, thank you for having me on. That's great. Great
Thanks,
questions.
Robert.
It's good. Good discussion.
Excellent.